He was kicked out of a restaurant just for how he looked, but the manager had no idea who he really was, and what would happen next shook the whole city. It was a bright, wind-kissed Saturday afternoon in downtown Chicago, the kind of day that made the old bones of the city feel alive again, the sun casting long shadows on the sidewalks as people in crisp jackets strolled past brick buildings lined with shops, cafes, and polished cars. On a prime corner stood the Silver Spoon, a high-end restaurant so pristine it almost didn't feel real. The kind of place where the napkins were folded like swans, the wine list weighed more than a Bible, and the waiters seemed to glide, more than walk. It wasn't just another fine dining spot. It was a shrine to exclusivity, a monument to status, a temple where elegance was the religion, and only the chosen few were welcome to worship. Inside, laughter floated like soft jazz, plates were placed like paintings, and 1,000 little details whispered the same word: perfection. At the center of this flawless machine stood Brad Whitmore, the general manager, tall and trim in a custom-tailored suit, every hair in place, every word practiced, every gesture measured. He was the kind of man who believed in keeping things just so, the lighting dim but not dark, the music tasteful but never distracting, and most of all, the clientele on brand. Brad had spent years curating a particular image for the Silver Spoon, and he took pride in knowing every regular by name, shaking hands with local politicians, and seating TV personalities without even checking the reservation book. He called it preserving the standard, but those who really paid attention knew it often meant something else: deciding who did and who didn't belong. Around 1:30 p.m., as the kitchen prepared its second round of lunch service, the front doors swung open and a man stepped in. He wasn't loud or flashy, no designer labels screaming for attention, just a tailored navy blazer over a charcoal button-down, crisp dark jeans, polished shoes, and the quiet air of someone used to being places that mattered. His name was Marcus Green. He walked with the kind of composure you earn, not buy. His face, carved by years of observation and wisdom, held a soft strength. There was a weight to his presence, something respectful and measured, like a man who'd lived through both storms and sunlight and learned how to walk with dignity through both. He scanned the room with kind eyes, clearly appreciative of the setting but not impressed by it, like he'd seen better and worse, and understood both. Marcus stepped forward toward the host stand, calm and respectful, and offered his name for the reservation. Brad noticed him the second he entered, and in that moment something shifted. Not in the room, not in the air, but in Brad. His smile disappeared, his brow furrowed. And even though Marcus was dressed sharper than half the men already seated, even though he spoke with polite clarity and obvious confidence, Brad looked at him as if he'd walked in through the wrong door. Brad didn't check the system, didn't ask a server to verify the reservation, didn't even offer a glass of water. Instead, he folded his arms and said, "We're full today. You must be mistaken." The tone wasn't apologetic. It was dismissive, cold, loaded. Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly, still polite. "I booked online 2 weeks ago. Table for one, under green." But Brad didn't budge. "We have a very strict reservation policy," he said flatly, "and our clientele expect a certain consistency. Now, if you're watching this and you've ever been looked at like you didn't belong in a place where you knew you did, then you already know what Marcus felt in that moment. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't even anger. It was the kind of quiet insult that doesn't shout. It stings. The kind that wraps itself in professional words and subtle glances, but underneath it all, says the same thing. You're not one of us. And if you believe in treating people with dignity, if you've ever taught your kids or grandkids that a man should be judged by his character and not his skin or his shoes, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Because here we tell real stories. Stories that speak to justice, to respect, to decency, the kind of values you don't just talk about, you live by. If that matters to you, stick around. Because what happened next, well, it shook this restaurant to its foundation. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for the manager. He was already talking to him. He didn't pull out a phone or drop any names. Instead, he looked Brad in the eye, paused for a long moment, and with quiet grace said, "Thank you." And then he turned and walked out. Just like that. No scene, no fight. Just that look. A look that said he'd been here before. That he'd seen this brand of polite rejection in too many rooms across too many cities. And that's when something strange happened. A couple at the corner table, who'd overheard everything, exchanged glances. A young waiter behind the bar, jaw clenched, watched Marcus walk away. The hostess at the front hesitated, clearly torn. But no one said a word. No one stood up. Brad went back to pretending he was in control, not realizing that by the time the front door closed behind Marcus Green, the biggest storm of his career had already begun. Because the man he just dismissed wasn't just a well-dressed stranger. He was one of the most respected and quietly powerful food critics in the country, and his silence wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Brad Whitmore stood by the host stand, smoothing down the sleeves of his suit as if brushing away the tension, convincing himself he had done the right thing, preserving the integrity of the restaurant, keeping things on brand, as he liked to say. But deep down, something in him itched with unease, a sliver of doubt he refused to name. Across the dining room, the crystal glasses clinked and soft laughter bubbled up from well-dressed tables, the curated soundtrack of luxury masking what had just taken place. For the patrons, the world spun on uninterrupted. But for Marcus Green, who now walked slowly down the sidewalk outside, the rejection still clung to him like smoke after a fire. He had been through this before. Doors politely closed, eyes averted, words wrapped in civility but hollow with condescension. It didn't matter that he was successful, articulate, respected in elite circles. It didn't matter that he had more culinary experience than most executive chefs on the block. To Brad, in that moment, he was just another man who didn't fit. Marcus had once promised himself that he wouldn't let moments like this define him, that the best response to quiet bigotry was louder excellence, but today it stung deeper than usual. Maybe it was because he'd actually been looking forward to this lunch. Maybe it was because he'd heard a young chef had recently joined the Silver Spoon's kitchen and was making waves with her innovative flavors. Or maybe it was because he was simply tired. Tired of smiling through it, tired of biting his tongue, tired of having to carry himself perfectly just to be treated like a human being. But still, he didn't retaliate. He didn't call out Brad's behavior publicly, didn't storm back inside demanding to speak to the owner. No, he went home, sat in his quiet apartment overlooking the lake, and reflected. He thought about the years he'd spent building his reputation, writing for prestigious food journals, mentoring young chefs from underserved neighborhoods, and helping small family-run restaurants gain national attention. He thought about the time he sat across from a grieving widower who'd cooked his late wife's recipes to keep her memory alive, and how that food, simple, soulful, had brought tears to both their eyes. He thought about what food meant to him, and why it hurt so much when someone used it as a gatekeeping tool, a weapon of exclusion. He drafted a brief note to his followers, more than 1 million of them across platforms, describing what had happened. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. He didn't name-call or rant. He didn't accuse. He simply told the truth, ending with a line that hit like a hammer. "I've eaten at 5-star restaurants in Paris, underground kitchens in Tokyo, and food trucks on back alleys in Detroit, but I've never been made to feel so unwelcome. Not for my food, not for my words, but for who I am." The post went live at 4:12 p.m. By 6:05 p.m. it had gone viral. Comments flooded in, some sharing similar stories, some expressing outrage, and others tagging the Silver Spoon's account demanding accountability. Local news outlets picked up the story, then national ones. The restaurant's Yelp and Google pages were bombarded with negative reviews. People began calling for boycotts. Meanwhile, inside the Silver Spoon, Brad was completely unaware of the firestorm brewing beyond the velvet-curtained windows. He was reviewing wine orders with the sommelier when his assistant nervously approached with her phone, eyes wide. "You need to see this," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Brad scrolled through the post once, then again, the blood draining from his face. "Who the hell is Marcus Green?" he muttered, already knowing the answer deep down. By morning, his name was on every media outlet from coast to coast. Customers canceled reservations. A corporate investor demanded a public statement. The restaurant's phone rang off the hook, not with bookings, but with questions. Brad tried to play it cool, tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but every time he opened his mouth, he dug the hole deeper. He said things like, "We follow strict policies," and "It was an unfortunate confusion," but people weren't buying it. They saw the video, they read the post, and they knew exactly what they were looking at. What stung the most was that Marcus never even had to raise his voice. He never demanded justice. He didn't need to. The truth spoke louder than rage, and just when Brad thought it couldn't get any worse, a second post from Marcus dropped. A video this time. In it, Marcus sat in his living room speaking directly to the camera, voice calm, eyes steady. He didn't call for boycotts. He didn't ask anyone to cancel anything. He just talked. About the first time he was denied entry to a restaurant, as a teenager, about how food had become his way to connect across divides, and how he believed places like the Silver Spoon had the power to bring people together, but only if they chose to. He ended with a question. What does it say about us when the places built to celebrate culture and connection become the very walls that keep people out? The video struck a chord. It was shared by celebrities, chefs, even politicians, and, for Brad Whitmore, the walls he'd built so carefully to protect his idea of luxury began to crack. One silent voice at a time. But nothing hit harder than what he discovered the following day. Marcus hadn't just been a random patron with a popular following. He had been secretly scheduled to write a feature piece on the Silver Spoon for a major publication, one that could have catapulted the restaurant into the culinary stratosphere. The article had already been assigned. The opportunity had already been given. Brad had turned away not just a guest, but a lifeline, and all because in that brief instant, he made a judgment that cost him more than he could have imagined. Because the man he looked in the eye and dismissed was the very man whose words could have defined the future of his career. By sunrise the next morning, the once humming prestige of the Silver Spoon had curdled into chaos, and Brad Whitmore, still nursing a strong coffee and the fraying remnants of his own ego, walked into a restaurant that felt less like a temple of fine dining and more like a sinking ship. The phones were ringing off the hook, but no one wanted reservations. They wanted answers. The inbox was a graveyard of cancellations, corporate parties, anniversaries, even a wedding rehearsal dinner. And the once polished foyer now echoed with tension and clipped conversations among a staff that could barely look their manager in the eye. Brad's phone buzzed non-stop. Local news vans circling like vultures outside, bloggers dissecting his background, internet sleuths digging through old staff complaints, and former employees sharing stories that painted a disturbing picture of a man obsessed with image at the expense of integrity. His social media profiles were doxed, his name dragged through digital mud, and every attempt he made to post a calm, clarifying statement was met with venom and screenshots of Marcus's quiet, devastating video. In it, Marcus never attacked. Never even mentioned Brad's name. He just sat there, composed and heartbreakingly honest, explaining that respect isn't something you should have to earn just to be treated like a human being. This wasn't about food, he said softly. This was about being seen. His words cut deeper than any accusation could have. They reminded people of their own moments of dismissal, of the cold feeling of being overlooked, misjudged, uninvited. And as the video racked up millions of views, the Silver Spoon's carefully curated empire began to crumble. Brad's business. Partner Alan flew in from New York, face pale with fury and panic. "Do you understand what you've done?" he hissed behind closed doors. "We had an investor meeting next month. We were set to expand. Now we're a cautionary tale." Staff meetings grew tense. Waiters debated quitting. The head chef, who'd been building her own following thanks to her innovative dishes, threatened to walk unless the restaurant issued a full apology, not a statement drafted by a PR firm, but a real, face-to-face acknowledgement. Brad refused. He still clung to the belief that this would pass, that people would move on, that his version of professionalism would protect him, but that illusion shattered when a former hostess came forward on social media, describing similar incidents. How Brad would often question reservations under certain names. How he'd coach staff to be extra vigilant with certain guests. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. People knew. They felt it. The pattern was obvious. What had once been a whisper behind the velvet curtain was now a chorus outside the door. Reporters camped out across the street, hoping to catch Marcus returning, but he stayed quiet, letting the silence say what needed to be said. Inside the restaurant, the staff began receiving hateful messages, some from angry supporters of Marcus demanding justice, others from reactionary voices siding with Brad and spewing vitriol at anyone defending him. The entire team was caught in the crossfire of a war they hadn't asked for. And still, Brad didn't flinch. Not until his own family started calling. His sister, a civil rights attorney, left a voicemail he would never forget. "Brad, I love you. But you've got to own this. Not spin it, not defend it. Own it. Or you're going to lose more than just your job. You're going to lose who you are." But he wasn't ready to listen. He was still too focused on salvaging what was left. He called Marcus's agent, hoping for a meeting, a chance to apologize privately, maybe cut a deal. But the call was never returned. Instead, a new post appeared from Marcus. Just a still image of the restaurant's front door with the caption, "Some doors still only open for a few. That needs to change." The photo went viral instantly, and with it came something worse than anger. Disappointment. Marcus's followers weren't shouting anymore. They were quiet. Calm. Hurt. And that quiet disappointment did more damage to the Silver Spoon than any boycott ever could. Within 48 hours, the restaurant was no longer listed in the top dining guides it once boasted proudly. Awards were rescinded. A longtime wine distributor cut ties, citing a misalignment of values. A feature in a luxury lifestyle magazine was pulled last minute, replaced with a profile on a new bistro committed to inclusive excellence. Even the landlord reached out to express concern about the brand's future viability on such a visible corner of downtown. But the final blow came not from a journalist or critic, but from someone within. One of Brad's most trusted servers, Miguel, a quiet man who had worked there for 8 years and had once considered Brad a mentor, walked into his office with tears in his eyes and said, "You taught me how to pour wine, how to greet a table, how to carry myself in a room like this. But I never realized you were also teaching me who was worth serving." And with that, Miguel placed his apron on the desk and walked out, leaving Brad alone in a restaurant full of empty tables, ringing phones, and echoing regret. For the first time in his life, Brad Whitmore didn't know what came next. Because the power he thought he had wasn't power at all. It was privilege built on exclusion. And now, stripped bare, he had to face the one thing he never thought he'd see in his own reflection. A man whose legacy was built on keeping others out. Brad Whitmore sat in his office with the blinds drawn, the lights off, and the cold reality of his undoing seeping into every corner like a slow, unforgiving leak. The once confident manager who'd commanded staff with a glance and curated exclusivity, like an art form, now found himself pacing, muttering, watching his phone buzz and buzz with calls he no longer had answers for. Each ring reminded him that control had slipped through his fingers like dry sand, and that the polished image he'd clung to for years had cracked beyond repair. Every attempt to manage the narrative only made things worse. His forced apology video, with its stiff posture and carefully measured language, was picked apart for its lack of sincerity. Why does someone have to be a celebrity to deserve respect? One commenter asked. That question echoed louder than any accusation. Staff morale had collapsed. Influencers scrubbed their photos taken at the Silver Spoon. Prominent partnerships vanished overnight, and even the restaurant's prized spot on a televised culinary tour was quietly replaced with a newer, more inclusive venue. The owner, a New York-based hospitality magnate named Evelyn Shaw, finally arrived. Furious, disappointed, and carrying the kind of authority that made even Brad sweat. She didn't waste time. "What happened here isn't just bad PR," she said, voice calm but razor sharp. "It's a betrayal of everything this brand is supposed to represent." And then she did something no one expected. She called Marcus green directly. It was a private gesture, personal and human, an attempt not just to repair the restaurant's reputation, but to confront the deeper wound. Marcus agreed to meet, not out of obligation or pride, but because he believed in something bigger, that healing only begins when the truth is faced head-on. A few days later, just as the city began settling into its usual rhythm, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the Silver Spoon. Marcus stepped out, dressed sharply as always, his presence quiet, but commanding. The street fell silent, as if holding its breath. Patrons, staff, reporters, they all watched. Inside, Evelyn, Brad, and Marcus sat behind closed doors. No cameras, no social media posts. Just three people face to face, forced to reckon with the fallout of judgment, silence, and missed humanity. The details of the meeting were never made public, but what emerged from that room shifted the tide in ways no one saw coming. Later, that evening, Brad stood before the remaining staff and announced his resignation. No theatrics, no victimhood, just a somber acknowledgement that he had failed, not only as a manager, but as a person. For the first time, his words didn't feel rehearsed. They felt earned. "I lost sight of what mattered," he said, "and I've got a lot of work to do, on myself, not just on paper." There were no applause, just silence. Some nodded, some turned away. But in that moment, something cracked. Not the restaurant's image, which had long since shattered, but the wall Brad had built around himself. As news of his resignation spread, Marcus was seen walking the dining room with Evelyn, speaking to the staff not as a critic, not as a celebrity, but as someone who understood what it meant to be overlooked and still choose grace over bitterness. He asked questions, listened carefully, praised dishes that remained excellent despite the storm. That night, Marcus dined not in protest but in purpose. He ordered the chef's special, gave thoughtful feedback, and even shared a quiet laugh with the sommelier. The staff, tense at first, began to ease, not because the damage had been undone, but because something resembling respect was being rebuilt from the ashes. And when asked by a young server why he had agreed to return after all that had happened, Marcus simply said, "Because someone has to show what dignity looks like when the world forgets." That meal wasn't reviewed on any blog. It wasn't posted about on social media. But those who were there, staff and patrons alike, described it as one of the most powerful nights in the restaurant's history. It wasn't about food that evening. It was about honesty, humility, and the long road to redemption. Marcus didn't offer forgiveness as a performance. He offered it as a challenge to grow, to see, to do better. Evelyn later announced that the restaurant would undergo not only operational restructuring but cultural training and community outreach initiatives to ensure its future reflected the diversity and openness that had been missing. A new manager was brought in, someone known not for exclusivity, but for hospitality. And though many said the Silver Spoon would never fully recover its former glow, others believed it had found something far more valuable: a soul. As for Brad, he quietly stepped away from the spotlight. He was last seen working with a nonprofit that helped young people of color get their start in the hospitality industry, not as a headline, not as a redemption arc, but as a man trying, piece by piece, to rebuild what he had broken. And while time would tell if his transformation was lasting, what mattered that night was that Marcus had chosen a path that so many wouldn't. He didn't demand an apology. He created a moment where growth was possible. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, as the staff cleaned up from the most emotionally charged dinner service they'd ever hosted, one server turned to another and whispered, "I think we just witnessed something bigger than a meal." Because what happened inside those walls wasn't just a turning point for a restaurant. It was a turning point for every person who ever believed that dignity doesn't need an invitation to take its seat at the table. And just when the dust seemed to settle, a surprising announcement was made, one that would change the future of the Silver Spoon forever. A week after the storm had passed, with the media frenzy cooled and the final Yelp reviews settling into a more measured chorus, the Silver Spoon quietly reopened its doors for a special evening unlike any it had hosted before. No velvet rope, no press coverage, no VIP list curated by publicists or socialites. Just a simple invitation titled "A Seat at the Table," sent to chefs, service staff, food writers, local leaders, and community members from every walk of life, those often celebrated and those too often ignored. The dining room looked different that night, not because of new decor or lighting, but because the energy had shifted. Gone was the stiff air of exclusivity. In its place was a soft, human warmth, the kind that lingers not just in ambiance but in intent. The tables were round, symbolically arranged so no one sat at the head. Everyone, for the first time in a long time, truly had a seat. The event had been Evelyn Shaw's idea, but Marcus Green had helped shape it, quietly, thoughtfully, with a level of care that only someone who had been on both sides of the door could offer. As guests found their places, plates of food arrived that weren't focused on prestige but on stories. Dishes from immigrant grandmothers, soul food from Chicago's South Side, childhood favorites reimagined by up-and-coming chefs who never thought they'd cook in a place like the Silver Spoon. And then, as dessert was cleared and a respectful hush fell over the room, Marcus stood up, not behind a podium, but right where he had been sitting, at eye level with everyone in the room. He wasn't introduced with fanfare. He didn't ask for attention. He just stood, waited a breath, and began. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. He spoke not about himself or even about that afternoon when he was turned away, but about the role food plays in our lives, as a connector, a memory keeper, a bridge between people who may never understand each other fully, but can still sit down at the same table. He said, "Food, at its best, reminds us that we all hunger for the same things: comfort, joy, recognition, love. And when we serve it with prejudice, we poison more than the meal." He looked around the room, at young servers who had felt powerless that day, at old-school chefs who had doubted his critiques, at Evelyn, who had risked a lot to turn the ship around. "This isn't about canceling anyone," he said. "It's about remembering who we claim to be and living up to it. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, not because of who they are, but because of who we are." The room was silent, but not stiff, just full of people holding something bigger than applause. Afterward, there were handshakes that lasted a little longer than usual, eye contact that carried more weight than words. Some of the kitchen staff who hadn't even been on shift the day Marcus was turned away came forward to thank him, not just for coming back, but for showing them that mistakes, when faced with humility, could become turning points instead of dead ends. And though Brad Whitmore wasn't in attendance, he had respectfully declined, still on his own path of reflection. His absence was felt not with bitterness, but as a quiet echo of the changes now set in motion. Over the next few months, the Silver Spoon slowly rebuilt its standing, not as a hotspot for the elite, but as a place known for its hospitality, its evolving culture, and its willingness to learn. Staff turnover dropped. Community events increased. A scholarship program was launched for young culinary students from underserved neighborhoods, named in honor of Marcus's grandmother, who had taught him how to taste before he ever picked up a pen. As for Marcus, he didn't linger in the spotlight. He returned to doing what he loved: traveling, eating, writing. But his voice carried a little further now, not just because of the followers or fame, but because of what he had chosen not to do. He hadn't raged. He hadn't retaliated. He had held up a mirror and then offered a seat at the table instead of slamming the door. And that choice, in the end, changed more than policy or perception. It changed people. His story became something quietly passed along in hospitality circles, management trainings, and even among waitstaff on break, reminding everyone that behind every guest is a life you know nothing about, and behind every act of kindness, a chance to rewrite the script. Not with fanfare, not with hashtags, but with the daily choice to treat people as if they matter, even when no one's watching. Because they do. And as the last candle flickered out on that long shared table and the final chairs were tucked in, one truth remained: what you serve is only half the story. How you serve it tells the rest. At its core, this story isn't just about a restaurant or a reputation. It's about the kind of leaders we choose to be when the world isn't watching. True leadership isn't measured in control or image, but in humility, accountability, and the courage to make things right. Legacy isn't carved by perfection. It's shaped in the moments we own our failures, learn from them, and treat every person with the dignity they deserve. And discipline. Real, quiet discipline is what keeps us grounded when pride tempts us to look the other way. For every man who's worked hard to build something that lasts, whether a business, a name, or a sense of honor, this story is a reminder. It only takes one choice to lose respect, but it takes character to earn it back. If stories like this speak to the values you still hold close, I invite you to subscribe. Around here, we don't just tell stories, we pass on what matters.